My name is Meredith Lake. I'm a historian, author and broadcaster, the host of Soul Search on ABC Radio National, a weekly show about the lived experience of faith and spirituality. A few housekeeping matters. We are recording this evening for future broadcast on Soul Search, so it is very important that your mobiles are on silent, but please don't refrain from clapping or laughing as you see fit. The lectures do have a different format this year. Each night we will hear from our two speakers who will give a short talk each, and then we'll hear from them in conversation with one another. This will be followed by an audience question time, which is your chance to contribute. Perhaps think about your questions during the talk segment of the evening. And I'll explain now and again a bit later, but how to ask your question, because there are two ways this year. If you have a smartphone that's on silent, go to slido.com and enter the event code, which is hashtag NCL2019. You can see it up on the screen if you need to be reminded of that. But you can basically type in your question, it gets curated up the back, and if you add your name and where you're from, I'll know who's asking it to put the question to the Archbishops. If you'd prefer to use pen and paper, I believe they've been distributed on the seats. You can write your question down in the old way, and ushers will collect them and they'll enter it into Slido for you. The topic of this year's lectures, faith, hope and love, unchanging virtues in a changing world. In one of the most famous lines in the whole New Testament, from the Apostle Paul's first letter to the church in Corinth, we read, "Now these three remain, faith, hope and love, but the greatest of these is love." And three more times in the New Testament, these are expressly linked together. And together, they have an apparently eternal importance and quality. Yet in our present moment too, faith, hope and love are urgently relevant as we are set to consider together over the next 3 evenings. We'll be guided by our two speakers, the Anglican Archbishop of Sydney, Glenn Davies, and the Catholic Archbishop of Sydney, Anthony Fisher. Please give them a big, warm welcome. Since 2013, Glenn Davies has been the Anglican Archbishop of Sydney, succeeding Peter Jensen. Before that, he was Bishop of North Sydney for more than a decade. Before that, he was in pastoral ministry and in theological education as a lecturer at Sydney's Moore College. He has a PhD in theology from Sheffield University in the UK, and his thesis was published as the book Faith and Obedience, Studies in Romans chapters 1 to 4. Anthony Fisher has been the Catholic Archbishop of Sydney since 2014, succeeding George Pell. A bishop for more than a decade before that in Parramatta and as auxiliary bishop in Sydney, his vocational life began in the mid-1980s when he entered the Order of Preachers, the Dominicans. In the early 90s, he did his doctorate in bioethics at the University of Oxford on the subject of the just allocation of healthcare. His many books include Catholic Bioethics for a New Millennium, published by Cambridge University Press in 2011. If I can ask each of you a personal question to begin, I'm curious about the time before faith became, your job, even your field of expertise. Who were the most important early influences on you in becoming a person of Christian faith? Archbishop Davies.
Thank you, Meredith, for the personal question that you're asking me in front of all these people. For me, I grew up at St Paul's Seaforth, Anglican church in Northern Beaches, and going to the Sunday school teachers there, but there was actually particularly a deaconess. Her name was Mary Fuller, and she was instrumental in helping me understand faith and understanding who Jesus was, and in many ways I see her as a spiritual mentor. The pastor who came, the rector who came afterwards, Ron Patfield, was another spiritual guide for me, and I owe a lot to him in many ways for all kinds of reasons and all kinds of things, but that probably answers the question.
Thank you. Archbishop Fisher, who was significant for you?
I think probably my family were the biggest influences. I had a great aunt who was a mercy sister at the Mater Hospital in Crow's Nest, and we were a pretty ordinary Catholic family. We weren't especially devout, but it was in the background and often in the foreground. And so I grew up just knowing that we should love God. And so I'd have to say my mum and dad and perhaps that great aunt were the biggest early influences on my faith.
Thank you. It's remarkable that as the Catholic and Anglican Archbishops, you're not only sharing the stage this evening, but co-delivering this series of public lectures for the first time, I'm told, in Australian history. Archbishop Davies, could you have imagined that, growing up in the 1950s and 60s, a rather sectarian era then, wasn't it?
Yes, it was. Catholics and Anglicans didn't always mix very well. I had my friends of my parents who were in mixed marriages, and that was very difficult, I know. And it's lovely to see ways in which things have changed a great deal. We still have our differences. But I shan't accept them tonight.
I think that's why we've all come, actually.
Is that right? There might be a private session afterwards, I don't know.
Well, Q&A. What does it say, though, about the changed landscape of faith in Australia? Would you speculate?
Me?
Yes.
Well, it's interesting. I think the churches have probably grown closer together in the way in which society and the churches have grown further apart. And I think that's the recognition. So Anthony and I stood shoulder to shoulder in some rallies, not our normal place of discourse, of recent days on the abortion legislation. And that's been a wonderful, in my view, show of collegiality and unity among Christians. And there are differences, yes, of course, but in terms of the world and society, we have so much more in common with regard. We believe the creeds, we believe the Bible, and that's very important. And I think that's helped change. I think, and the other thing is relationships. So that the relationships that His Grace and I share has been very personal and very influential, I think, in the things we've been able to do together.
Archbishop Fisher, given historic and persistent differences between the two churches, what does your presence here signify, do you hope? An Anglican college co-lecturing. What are we to make of that? What do you make of that?
I think it's a beautiful thing. There would be many countries in the world where this couldn't happen, even between Christians of different confessions, and certainly not, say, between Christians and another religion. But we are in a country where we very much value each other and live and let live and share what we have and treasure what we have in common. I genuinely count Glenn one of my friends, and that couldn't have happened, I suspect, back in the 100 years ago, maybe even 50 years ago, and still in some parts of the world. But thanks be to God, it can happen in this country, and it's something very beautiful that we can work together on all sorts of things, like recently on some political, social issues, that we now intermarry without people deciding to write you off and expel you from the family, that in all sorts of ways we are the sort of friends and neighbours that Christians tell the world we should be, but haven't always been good examples of.
Well, please welcome Archbishop Davies to speak now on faith in a sceptical society. Thank you, Archbishop.
Well, thank you very much indeed, Meredith, for your kind introduction. And also thank you, Dr. Pearson, for your invitation to be here tonight in this very historic occasion, I see as well. And to be here particularly on the 50th anniversary of the founding of New College, it probably can be called Old College now, is very auspicious for me and Archbishop Fisher to be among you. It's wonderful for me too. It's a distinct honour to invite Archbishop Fisher onto Protestant ground, and the territory of the Anglican New College is wonderful in this unusual format for the New College lectures, I realise, but I trust it'll be an engaging time for us all as we engage in the unchanging virtues of a changing world of faith, hope and love. In this talk, I pose the question, what is the place of faith in our increasingly sceptical society? There are many who would readily give the answer, none at all. They would echo the saying commonly attributed to the French atheist Denis Diderot, men will never be free until the last king is strangled with the entrails of the last priest. True freedom, they say, can only come when we throw off the shackles of religion, including the fetters of faith. Religion is nothing more than a regrettable, irrational and irrelevant hangover from our pre-scientific past. Religion is worthy only of mockery and sneering contempt from all right-thinking people everywhere. For example, the Sydney Morning Herald sports journalist Peter Fitzsimons mocks classic Christianity as a belief that a cosmic Jewish zombie who is his own father can make you live forever if you symbolically eat his flesh and drink his blood, while telepathically telling him that you can accept him as your master so that he can remove an evil force from your soul which is present in all humanity because a woman made out of one rib of bone and a mound of dirt was tricked into eating fruit from a magical tree by a talking snake. Well, my goal in this talk is twofold. Firstly, to reassure people of faith that they are on the intellectual high ground, because religious faith is both rational and reasonable. Secondly, to identify the significance of faith is in its object rather than in its subject. To do this, I want to challenge the definition of faith, or better, the caricature of faith, that is the straw man set up by the opponents of faith. What is faith? Faith is not contra-rational. Not, as Richard Dawkins opines, faith is the great cop-out, the great excuse to evade the need to think and evaluate evidence. Faith is belief in spite of, even perhaps because of, the lack of evidence, end quote. We must not cede the ground to the atheists and let them define faith as being the opposite of reason. For faith at its very heart is trust. Specifically, religious faith is trust in the promises of God. Whether or not faith is rational depends on whether the object of trust is trustworthy. In fact, we all exercise faith when we came into this lecture tonight. When we walked into the room after we'd had a few things to eat, presuming and you got a seat, you trusted the chair to support you. You'd probably never sat in that particular chair beforehand. You trusted its designer, its maker, as well as those responsible in the college for maintaining its durability. You knew it would support you, or did you? If it could have had a defective frame, it could have been due for removal for the maintenance shed, it could have been on its last legs, so to speak. Yet, as you entrusted yourself to the chair, which did not collapse under your weight, what upheld you? Your faith or the chair? The answer is clearly the chair. Faith does not protect you, for your faith could have been misplaced. The faith that enables you to sit in a chair that holds you up, or in a chair that collapses under your weight, is the same faith in both instances. We use our senses to make decisions which involve faith. Often it might be our experience of faith events, or it may be a trust in the circumstances which face us. However, in each case, faith is personal. It is part of our human condition. We are personal, and we exercise faith when we trust another person. And perhaps if the usher had informed you that the chair was safe and you would be secure, would that help? Well, if you could trust the usher, then it would. Faith in another person reflects the very core of faith. Whether you believe in climate change because you trust the expert scientists, or whether you believe in an ancient fact because you trust your history teacher, faith is not so much a conviction about an idea, but an exercise of trust in a person. Let me try an experiment. I have in my pocket something that no one has ever seen before. In fact, I've never seen it before. I'll allow that God has seen it because God sees all things. But no human eye has seen what I have in my pocket. What do I have in my pocket then, you ask? Well, if I decline to tell you, will you still believe me? Do you have faith in an archbishop? This is the Protestant archbishop. Do you have faith in an archbishop that he is telling you the truth? Or will your scepticism take hold of you as you consider me to be either a deranged fool or a consummate liar? On the other hand, could it be possible that I'm actually telling you the truth? Of course, you'd love to see the evidence, wouldn't you, before committing yourself. However, the normal sceptical response is that since you can't imagine that I could have anything in my pocket, something that no one has ever seen, then it just can't possibly be true. In other words, you will be the arbiter of truth. Not only that, you'll be the arbiter of what is possible. Because from the limitations of your own experience, let alone imagination, you just can't see how it is possible that I've got something in my pocket that no one has ever seen before. So, at the risk of making this difficult for me, I'm going to ask you as an audience to put up your hands if you believe I'm telling the truth. Just raise your hand if you believe there's something in my pocket that no one has. Well, that's interesting, isn't it? Would you all people move to the left, please? And the others move to the right. So what is it about me that you don't trust? Why is it you can't exercise faith? I didn't see if you put your hand up, actually. Now, I notice the Archbishop does believe me, and he does not know, we've not pre-arranged this, he does not know what's in my pocket, but I'm his friend, as you've heard, and he believes me. He hasn't the foggiest idea what's in my pocket, but, you know, we want to remain friends, so he's clearly put his hand there. I didn't see what Meredith did. But that's all right, that's okay. He hasn't seen the evidence, but he trusts the person. That's the essence of faith. The Apostle Paul describes Abraham's faith in this way. When it was impossible for Sarah to conceive, Abraham believed God's promises that she would conceive. It was the basis of God's word to Abraham that what was inconceivable could actually be conceived. And so Abraham believed God. He didn't have any evidence of Sarah's fertility. In actual fact, he had evidence to the contrary. They'd been to the IVF clinics of the day, had no success. He knew that she was 95 in the shade, so therefore the likelihood of her conceiving was pretty well zero. But God promised conception. And Abraham believed. He trusted God. And of course, as we know, sometime later, she conceived and Isaac was born. The Bible tells us that our faith in God is dependent upon the faithfulness of God. In fact, the word faith and faithfulness in the Greek and also in the Hebrew is exactly the same word. So when Paul uses the phrase the faith of God, he's actually talking about the faithfulness of God. That it's God's faithfulness, it's the fidelity to himself and his character and his word that is the assurance of our faith. The argument of the apostle is advancing is that nothing can undermine the faithfulness of God. We must reorder our thinking if we think that God might lack fidelity and truthfulness. Let God be true, though everyone a liar. Now I realise that we're not in Abraham's shoes, or sandals as the case may be. Abraham encountered God face to face and had a direct promise of God to rely upon. So how do we know whether God is true and trustworthy? And the answer is in his word. The scriptures reveal God's character and his actions and his creation of the world, the fulfilment of his promises to ancient Israel, and most especially to the world in the coming of Jesus, in his death and resurrection. God demonstrated that he is dependable, that he is trustworthy. He promised to send a saviour, and he did. If you'd lived in the first century Israel, you could have met him, and like those around him, seen the evidence of God's existence, of his power, of his sovereignty, and most of all of his love. Because of God's revelation of himself in the Bible, faith in God is consistent with reason and is highly rational. Faith is not inconsistent with reason. It's only inconsistent with scepticism. Yet scepticism is its own enemy because of its limitations of experience and knowledge. As has been demonstrated tonight, some of you did not trust me. Perhaps because you don't know me. And that evidences the fact that trust is relationship to a person. But those of you who do know me, I'm grateful for you, those who I asked you to put their hands up before the lecture began. Those who do know me, well, let me tell you, for those who did not trust me, I believe your imagination is too small and your distrust is misplaced. This is what was in my pocket. It's a peanut shell. Many people have seen the outside, but no one on earth has actually seen the inside of this peanut. Would you not agree? And those who did not raise their hands, how do you feel now? A sceptical world is built on distrust. But this is unworkable as people cannot live in complete distrust and are therefore inconsistently sceptical. Deep down, we all want to trust something or someone. Our relationships with one another are based on trust, whereas scepticism is poison in relationships. This is true not only in the human sphere, but in our relationship with God. Fundamentally, faith in God is the only way to live consistently in God's world. Christian faith involves trusting God on his terms, not our own. We walk by faith and not by sight. We walk because God beckons us so to walk that we might enjoy the riches of his blessings as we walk in the obedience of faith. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Archbishop Davies. Please welcome now Archbishop Anthony Fisher, who will speak on faith in a secular society.
Thank you, Meredith, and might I begin by thanking Dr. Pearson and all at New College for inviting me to join in conversation with Archbishop Glenn Davies for this year's New College lectures. I think it's a great honour but it's also a tribute to the ecumenical spirit and generosity of the Anglican Church and of New College. Thank you for inviting me onto your patch. New Year's Eve 2015 was my strangest ever. I drifted in and out of consciousness as I lay almost totally paralysed and in great pain in the intensive care bed at St Vincent's Hospital. Around Christmas, I had contracted the rare and grave autoimmune disease Guillain-Barré syndrome. A friend fed me French champagne through a straw from a paper cup, and for a few brief moments, the half-light and monitor beeps of ICU were masked by the Sydney Harbour fireworks on TV. Then the nurses turned up the morphine and I went back to sleep. Something had provoked my immune system to attack my peripheral nerves. I spent 5 months in hospital, gradually repairing my nerves, rebuilding wasted muscles, being relieved of neuropathic pain, and learning again to walk, climb stairs, hold things, write. It was a sometimes terrifying and agonising experience, if also, I trust, a time for a little getting of wisdom, humility, and compassion for the weak. When people asked what sense I made of it all, I groped for answers as anyone would, and fell into silences as everyone should. My reaction was significantly shaped by the friendship and care surrounding me, by the wisdom traditions I'd been immersed in since my birth, and by the examples of suffering well and healing well that I'd personally witnessed. Blessed with the gift of faith and many years of reflection on the mysteries of life and death, sickness and health, I was as well equipped as one could be to approach my unnerving condition. But faith and philosophy don't take such suffering away. Given the season it was, I meditated upon the sheer helplessness of the Christmas babe. God become baby lies not just in some romantic Christmas crib, but alongside each of us at our most vulnerable, when we are unborn, disabled or dying, abused, unwanted or detained, sick of body, heart or spirit. To the defenceless he lends his power, to the voiceless his words, to the victims his healing. Faith, as I experienced it in my hospital manger, is belief in God and his revealed promises, but also my free response, recommitting myself to him and his plan. Without faith, I might have found no meaning beyond laws of biology, bad luck, and a chance for self-motivation. But faith offered me some meaning, comfort, and hope, without quarantining me from life's challenges or making everything simple. Faith, hope, and love are such rich subjects that we'll barely scratch their surfaces in 3 nights together. One aspect of them to which our series title draws attention is that they are virtues, not just values or quirks. They are personal qualities or excellences that by divine grace, human education, or personal cultivation become hardwired into our character, directing our emotions, guiding our conduct, facilitating our giving our best. Secondly, they can be natural, or human virtues. Everyday belief is trust or confidence in something or someone, as Glenn demonstrated in his example to us about whether we could believe he might have a peanut in his pocket. Everyday hope is desire or expectation about some future positive outcome. Everyday love, a strong interpersonal affection. But supernatural or theological faith, hope and charity have God for their origin, motive and object. They animate Christian life and can inform everyday virtues. As Archbishop Davies put it, faith is trust in God's promises. Faith develops knowledge of and relationship with God in this life and the next. Hope helps us to rest confidently in that knowledge and relationship while striving for the kingdom of heaven. And love makes us want that God and life more than anything and express it in service to others. Thirdly, Glenn has given us reasons to consider that faith is not irrational, that it has some rational, if also super-rational warrant, and that some otherworldliness can be an asset rather than hindrance in day-to-day living. Indeed, as he argued, consistent and total scepticism is unlivable. Building on his remarks on faith in a sceptical society, I'd like to say little about faith in a secular society. The secular marks out a non-religious sphere with its own particular goals, principles, methods, actors and institutions. We find it in Christ's command to render unto Caesar what is Caesar's and to God what is God's. Yet that distinction does not entail a sharp separation, as if the same person could not operate in both spheres, secular and sacred, or as if no collaboration between the two were possible. How sacred and secular relate is complex and varies with time and place. In Australia, for instance, church and state mostly leave each other well enough alone. Where they intersect, they are sometimes rivals for people's loyalty, sometimes each other's critics, but more often find common ground and ways to collaborate, for instance, in education, health and welfare. Recently, however, we've witnessed a more doctrinaire secularism that would exclude faith and the faithful from public life, confining faith to a narrowing field of private life. Believers are pressed to renounce their most deeply held beliefs, remain silent about their dirty little secret in the public square, or adopt a kind of dual personality. Absolutist secularism resents its Christian heritage and is determined to end its mother's influence. Of late, this has played out in well-publicised cases of discrimination against people of faith and proposed laws to address it. Abortion and euthanasia legislation denying conscience rights to health professionals and church hospitals. State interference in the sacrament of confession. A push to exclude churches from education funding, charity status, tax exemptions and government tenders. As a Christian leader, I protest discrimination against people of faith, insist that they have an important part to play in our culture, and seek to demonstrate the good churches do for the whole community. But to my shame, my own church has at times in history engaged in totalising, violent or exclusionary behaviour similar to that of the radical secularists today. We have also sometimes failed, even catastrophically, to provide the safety, and direction which people rightly expected from us. I repent and apologise, determined that my church not repeat these mistakes and resolved to do better. Only with humility and hope can I plead that our community help us to clean up our act while continuing to allow a generous space for faith and the faithful in our society. Well, why does it matter? There are many reasons to think that human beings are by nature religious beings, coming from God, tending toward God, living best in communion with God. Faith fulfills an important part of us. Some seek to substitute our spirituality or faith light, aesthetic experiences or ascetic practices, fitness, action for justice, peace or ecology, much of which I share. Some search for transcendence in less healthy places. Some compartmentalise their Sunday selves from their weekday, mostly living as practical agnostics. But such spiritual thinning and psychological bifurcation does not satisfy and may well be unsustainable. Likewise for societies. It's telling that radically secular communities are so often seem unable to let go of religion. They either keep protesting against something they tag irrelevant, or invent an alternative cult to Lady Reason, the Führer, or the ideology. Meanwhile, even secular institutions and culture rely for their underpinnings on virtues, values and practices inherited from Judeo-Christianity. We might consider faith's continuing contribution to education, health and aged care and social services, to our common morality, arts and sciences, and practices of celebration and mourning, and to the ideas that ground our politics, law, culture, and conversation. Faith, then, is divine promise and knowledge, sacred invitation and response, transcendent relationship and commitment. The life of faith and the faithful has contributed to our community in many positive ways. A healthy secularity will allow both church and state respectful spaces to do their own thing, as well as opportunities to collaborate and critique. Faith remains a crucial virtue in a changing world. In the words of that great theologian, George Michael, I gotta have faith, faith, faith.
Thank you, Archbishop Fisher. I'm sure that has stimulated many questions, and in about 20 minutes to half an hour, there'll be time for you to ask them when we move to questions from the floor. I'd just like to remind you to submit those questions, please, in one of the two ways we have available to us tonight. One, on your smartphone on slido.com with the hashtag NCL for New College Lectures 2019. That's a great way to do it. Otherwise, the pen and paper on your seats, the ushers will come and collect those shortly. So if you have a question, now is a great time to submit those. First, though, I'd like to invite the Archbishops to extend some of the ideas that they've ventured in their talks. Perhaps we can begin, Archbishop Fisher, with that description you gave of yourself as someone blessed with the gift of faith. That idea of faith as a gift to which you might then respond runs against the grain, I think, of some of the more popular notions of faith that circulate today. For example, the idea that maybe faith is something inherited, an aspect of your culture, something maybe even more or less synonymous with that culture. Then there's the idea of faith as an identity, something you choose for yourself, a tool of self-actualization, a step to belonging to a certain religious or even political tribe. So in what sense is faith a gift?
Okay. I think we all puzzle about why some people have faith and others don't. You might have two people who've had the same upbringing, the same advantages, the same influences, and yet one has faith and one doesn't. And we wonder why. And parents, grandparents worry about that their grandchildren don't seem to have the faith they had or don't practice the faith they had, and why is that? And so we wonder why some and not others. It's not that one group are completely irrational or hateful or ill-willed, and the other are very good at in all those respects. There's something else about it, and I think it's something about God gracing people. Now, it may be that God graces rather more people than ever identify as religious. And so there's an important aspect of invitation and response here. So some people might be given many invitations and they just don't come to the party. And it's interesting, there's a whole series of gospel parables about people being invited to wedding receptions, and some come and some don't. And I think faith's a bit like that invitation that comes in the post, quite gratuitous, to which we may or may not respond. And indeed, I think when we do respond well, that itself is grace at work in us. But there is something of a mystery in why some and not others. And I think that's what I was trying to get at with the idea of a gift.
Archbishop Davies, how do you understand faith in terms of gift?
I think Anthony's correct that it is a gift. The Bible describes us as being blind, or as our ears are stopped to us. C.S. Lewis describes pain as God's megaphone, whereby to make humans realise that he actually is there when things go wrong. We take him for granted when things go right. He sends his rain to fall and the sun to shine on the just and the unjust. But to actually, God, all that is needed for faith, God has given us. And it's our blindness, it's our rejection of God in the inmost parts of our being, even though at the same time the Bible says that everyone actually knows God ontologically within our very being. But we deny God, we refuse to believe in him, and we create idols instead. Old cultures made particular physical idols. We have other idols that we create to replace God. So yes, faith is a gift, and it actually is a work of God's grace to open blind eyes, to unstop deaf ears, so our muted voices can speak and say, yes, I believe, help my unbelief.
I'm curious then about the relationship of grace to virtue then, because we've also talked about faith as a virtue that might be cultivated or even practiced. That was a phrase of Thomas Aquinas's, wasn't it? That faith is a theological virtue. Perhaps Archbishop Fisher, you could help us understand that a bit better.
I certainly love the mention of St Thomas Aquinas, a very great theologian and a great thinker about virtue, and his thought that there are human or natural virtues that are in everybody, and they cultivate them, or they're educated to them, or they see fine examples of them and imitate them. So we work on courage in ourselves, or on prudence, or many of the other important human virtues. And there's a sense in which we can talk of faith in that way, the faith we have in each other, the faith we have that the sun will rise tomorrow, because it always has till now, the faith that the chair will hold us up, as Glenn talked about. But then there's another sense in which we use faith, which comes from God and points us towards God, and carries with it a whole package of a life with God. And that is what he called theological faith or supernatural faith. So often grace builds on nature, so it takes what's best in us, purifies what's weakest or worst in us away, and then elevates that to something even greater than we could ever be on our own. I think faith often is building on that natural human faith, taking away some of the superstition and nonsense that might be there, the prejudices and other things that are mixed up with our faith, and then elevates it to something much greater by God's gift.
Is there any sense in which faith is a requirement? Perhaps Archbishop Davies.
God invites everyone to believe in him. It's a requirement to be in right relationship with God at that level. But faith itself is not something which, although it's something in which we are active, it's not something which has merit in itself. So if I use the chair again, if I stand up and don't have faith in the chair won't hold me up. I'll still be standing and on my own 2 feet. Once I sit in the chair and exercise faith, the faith has no merit. It doesn't, because it doesn't hold me up. But what I've done is it's actually external to myself. I've entrusted myself to something else. And faith in God is exactly that. So faith in God is to say, it's all of you, God. It's great, and that's why grace is there. Grace is God's unmerited gift, his unmerited favour towards us. And faith is receiving that as a child receives something for no merit of the child, but just the grace of the giver. So yes, it's a requirement, but it's not a work which gains us favour.
Do you want to add to that or comment on that?
Yes.
500 years on from the Reformation? You don't have to.
There is a little of the Reformation in there, isn't there?
It's just St. Paul.
Someone had
really.
to say the R word.
It's as old as the Paul. Actually, it's as old as Abraham,
Yeah,
really.
I have a great affection for St. Paul. I'd say yes, and maybe I'd qualify it some way. I think we can do good things, worthy of our faith and of our God, worthy of our being in the image of God. Even those, we only choose to do those, freely choose to do those, because of God's grace at work in us. So I don't think that somehow there's something about me quite independent of the one who creates and sustains the universe and graces me in every minute of my existence. But there's some other me out there that can choose good things. And if Catholics have appeared to say that sometimes, well, boo to them.
Boo to them, yes, boo to them. Yes.
But I would say that we don't just kind of lie back and say, over to you, God, you do it all. He invites us into a project with him, into lives with him that involve a great deal of saying yes to God and saying yes to his creation and to each other and working with him for the salvation of humanity. And so in that sense, I'd use a word like merit without fear, that there are some things we do that are deeply culpable and others that are more meritorious because they're either with God or against God. They're either with his plan or against his plan.
Certainly true, faith without works is dead. So you must have obedience. It's the obedience of faith, obedience which is generated by faith. I thoroughly agree with that. And it's not that we can't do things that please God. We do things that please God, and that's his work in us, of course, too. But all the glory belongs to God because he's the one who saves us.
Perhaps to pick up another metaphor that's been bubbling along here, the metaphor of sight. We've heard about walking by faith and not by sight, but also about faith in terms of having eyes opened. I'm curious, I guess, about the terrain of faith. we live at a time where the idea of faith versus reason, religion versus science these are tropes we've lived with in the West for at least 150 years. My question is there a limit to the intellectual high ground, if you like, of the believer as a person with faith in God? Where does sight become the thing we need to rely on?
Well, sight is a gift of God, as everything else. And just as God opens our eyes, he reveals himself to us. In the Bible, we see descriptions whereby he does that by voice or by vision. And for us, where God is certainly capable of doing that again today, the normal means is through his word. He's revealed himself once and for all, as it were, in the Bible. And that revelation of the apostles and prophets of the New Covenant is the foundation of the church, foundation of faith for us, with Christ Jesus the cornerstone. So, but you see, faith is needed in science. Faith is needed in every human endeavour, because there's an order in the world whereby we, as Anthony says, we work on the basis the sun's going to rise tomorrow. Now, in actual fact, the sun doesn't rise, the earth sets, but it looks like it rises, and we can use that language, but we know what we mean, and we depend upon that because we have faith that God is actually, the universe is working in accordance to his pattern. Science doesn't make the sun rise every day. Only God does that.
Might science change how we understand Scripture and what it reveals of God, though?
I think Christianity is the most pro-science of any movement in history. It invented the university. It invented so much of the scientific method, and so much of research is done by Christian institutes, Christian hospitals, led the whole hospital movement in the West. Still to this day, Christian researchers are leading the way in many of the sciences at any particular time. So any notion that science and faith are inimical or incompatible, it just flies in the face of history. And I think that the personal experience of scientists, including today, as well as many of the great scientists of history. But that said, we need a certain humility. I don't know everything about everything. In fact, I don't know, there's a whole lot I don't know about a whole lot of things, including a great deal of the natural sciences and the social sciences for that matter. And so I don't pretend by virtue of my having Christian faith that gives me a kind of encyclopedic understanding of all aspects of reality. I have to have a certain humility about the limits of how much faith can show me, and what other parts of human life, whether that's science, the arts, other parts of human life, might also show me. And I think science needs a similar humility. Science may well tell us the way things are, but it can't tell us why there's anything at all. So there are some deeper or other questions which we go elsewhere for answers, but we recognise that each of us, a certain humility in our own sphere, can learn from each other. And often people can inhabit both spheres or many spheres at once.
Solomon was a great botanist. Solomon was a great proverb writer. Solomon was a lexicographer. Solomon had a great deal of wisdom which God gave him. And of course we can learn all kinds of things in the world by the gift that God gives us in discovery of human discovery of, take the human body. I just had my eyes tested by an optometrist. He sends me to an ophthalmologist. Ophthalmologist 1 sends me to ophthalmologist 2. And all the intricate subdivisions of ophthalmology, because the intricacies of that little tiny thing in your eye socket has got so much intricacy to it. And the way in which it works. Now, we learn all those things. the Bible will speak about the eye and speak about sight. It's not going to talk about cones and colour blindness and affections like that, disaffections like that. So, yes, so of course sight. We keep learning all kinds of things about the world. And as Anthony says, so many of the scientists were Christians. It's because of their Christian faith they saw order in the world and knew when they did an experiment it would come out that in the same way each time they did an experiment, as opposed to darkness, chaos world, which is the ultimate conclusion of an atheism, an agnosticism, where there is no God, and that it's all up to chance.
For many people, though, a story like Abraham conceiving a son with Sarah in his old age is right at the limits of what they might be prepared to believe, given the usual course of the conception of children and the age at which that might occur. Has there been an impact of certain sciences on the realm of faith that's limiting or shrinking in any area that you would accept? I'm struck by that phrase I read in Owen Chadwick's great history of the secularisation of the European mind, where he talks about the rise of the religion versus science argument of the 19th century, where he talks about the impact of the new science in terms of not a loss of faith, but the extension of the area of intellectual agnosticism, even in the minds of religious people. That idea that maybe you didn't believe with the same certainty everything that you believed before, because a new finding in biology or even in botany might change the way you think about what you thought you knew. Hasn't that happened?
It's happened, but I think it's illusionary. It's illusory because I'm talking to some doctors, and they said they had trouble with Jesus' words in the Sermon on the Mount that when salt has lost its flavour, it's no good, it should be thrown out. And they said to me, sodium chloride doesn't lose its flavour. So clearly Jesus got it wrong. The problem is, of course, Jesus wasn't talking about sodium chloride, he was talking about salt. He was talking about what people described as salt in the first century, which would have been sodium chloride plus impurities. When the number of impurities outweigh the sodium chloride, that which is called salt has lost its saltiness, and it's no good, needs to be thrown out. So therefore you need, what we often do is we bring our 21st century intellectual rigours to the text of a first century document or a 7th century BC document, and think that we understand it because the words seem the same, and you've got to work out what does that mean. In the same way as the Bible talks about the sun rising. And we still talk about the sun rising, even though we know the sun's not actually rising. It's the earth that's revolving and moving around the sun. So we have our own accommodations with regard to that. It's actually, I would still want to hold to the fact that when God speaks, he speaks truly. What we need to do is trust that, even when it's not fully understood by us. An epistemic humility, of which Anthony was speaking, is required, rather than think that we can work everything out from our own finite minds.
I think in some ways it's a liberation for people of faith that we don't have to pretend we have the answers to everything. That we don't have to pretend that the Bible tells you how to build a rocket to go to Mars. So I understand we're going to collaborate in doing with the Americans now. You don't look in the first book of Kings to find out how to build a rocket to go to Mars. So there are other places to go for such information, and it's a liberation to have the humility to recognise that, so that we don't have to pretend we know it all. But what we do know, because of this great gift from God, is the most crucial things, like why there's a Mars or a universe or a cosmos at all to delight in, to explore, to travel to. Why we exist to be the ones doing that and have the inquiring minds to explore the sciences and technologies. As I said, science will tell us the how, but not why there's anything at all. And you then look to things like faith and perhaps the arts and perhaps some other places if you're asking those other kind of more metaphysical questions or fundamental questions about life. And Just as we don't ask every scientist to give us the answer to those, so we don't ask every churchman to give us the answer to the scientific questions. We can do this collaboratively. We can be bouncing off each other, and even in some tension over some of these matters, without seeing the other as a threat or a danger to science is no danger to Christian faith. In fact, Christian faith gives it every encouragement and is enriched by it, by good science. But if it makes claims beyond its own discipline, if it claims to be able to tell us, for instance, that God can't exist or doesn't exist, well, that's beyond anything that the scientific method or experiments can ever show you. It's become vain instead of humble. And we, people of faith, can do the same in the other direction and have to avoid doing that too.
Hence walking by faith rather than sight at some point. Sociologically speaking, we can agree, though, there has been what might be called a loss of faith in Australia over the last several decades. And I wonder what to make of that phrase you used, Archbishop Fisher, that people are by nature religious. The Canadian philosopher Charles Taylor, for example, has written about the secular in terms of the emergence of conditions in which to have faith is now but one human possibility among others, and belief in God is no longer axiomatic. It's a loss of faith that some may grieve, but for others, they might not even register an absence there. What do you make of the declining proportion of Australians who are willing to make a formal religious identification?
I think she asked you.
Did you? Oh, good.
I'm sure you've thought about it.
I sure have. And without exaggerating or catastrophising the situation, because frankly, most Australians still identify as people of faith, and many of those that don't want to put their hand up that way in the census are still searching and would still say they pray sometimes, or they believe in some transcendence. So even those that don't put their hand up for a particular church or particular religious tradition may well be people of some faith. So I think we can exaggerate the inroads of secularism when people speak of Australia as a secular society. But nonetheless, I take your point that there are many people that would once have put up their hands, or whose parents, grandparents put up their hands as people of faith, are less willing to do so today, or less willing to commit time to practicing that faith in acts of worship or perhaps acts of charity in other ways. And that is a real loss, I think, for us in the communities of faith and for our wider community, because we've still not demonstrated any alternative that is as fruitful in terms of a community's life of charitable works, of inspiration for great philosophies and polities. So much of what I was talking about briefly in my speech about the underpinnings of our civilization that have been Christian, attempts to find other underpinnings for much the same ideas have not worked so far. And so we should count as a grave loss, even if we're not sure where we are on matters of faith ourselves, that is thinning in our community at the moment. For people of faith, it's even a sadder thing. We ache for those people that should be with us in our worship, in our works of charity and justice. We fear for their salvation. Will they ever find a relationship with God and a greater, deeper meaning in life and God's plan and purpose for them? So we really care about this without exaggerating or catastrophising the situation.
I think the days when lots of people went to church in the 1950s, for example, they were just going through routines. They weren't necessarily believers. They identified with, and I think even the census today I imagine it's true for the Catholics as well as for Anglicans. People tick the Anglican box because they went to an Anglican school rather than actually go to church now. And I think that's one aspect of our society. Our series is Faith, Hope and Love, Unchanging Virtues in a Changing World. And what the church needs to do is recognise we need to be cross-cultural because our world has changed. We can't do things that we used to do in the 50s. And there are all kinds of things that we need to reflect upon that. The truth is the same, the proclamation, the message is the same, but how we do that and identify it is so important. And of course, in the midst of this, I think the Royal Commission into Institutional Responses to Child Sex Abuse has been a great damage to the church. And if I can say, as I know Anthony would agree with me, we are ashamed as church leaders that people who owned our name in our denominations did such terrible things to young people. So there's a lot of trust that needs to be regained, not just by some manipulation or please trust us, but by demonstrating that in our care and our love and the work we do in the community, which is because we should be a people zealous for good works.
On that note, I do want to acknowledge that in a group of this size, there are doubtless survivors of one form of abuse or another, and people affected by that, and thank you for being here. You mentioned the word shame. Can I ask you, each archbishops, how has the disclosure and more importantly, the very fact of that systemic problem impacted your own personal faith in God and in the church?
I have had the honour of meeting with a number of survivors of abuse, as I'm sure Anthony has too. It's a very taxing time, and to listen to their story, because as you know, so often the stories were not believed when they were young.
Distrusted.
The distrust, of course. So I would normally see them after a process of counselling, redress. And in a sense, when they come to see me, it helps to bring them closure. That's the desire. And sometimes I have people of faith who've lost their faith. Sometimes I have people of faith who've held on to their faith. And despite everything, they still know that God is their saviour. And that's a wonderful thing. I always offer to pray with them before I finish, and only on one occasion has someone declined for me to pray for them. People who've lost their faith or no longer go to church are happy to have a prayer to God. So there is still that opportunity to do so, and there's still something within them that recognises, yes, that's a valuable thing, and they don't want to reject it, they want to receive it. But it is an awful thing to hear these stories, and but it's an honour to meet people who can come through that process, even though they'll never forget, and the scars of those wounds in the past will be with them for the rest of this life.
I've had a very similar experience to that, Glenn, and I think what was exposed about what particularly went on, it seems, in the 60s, 70s, early 80s, it may have gone on at some base level throughout history, but there was this terrible spike that the Royal Commission identified. It has shaken me up, and I think a lot of us religious leaders ask, what was wrong with the leadership at the time, with the selection and formation of candidates and their supervision thereafter, with the culture that allowed a kind of privileged class, not just amongst clergy, but clergy included, to kind of get away with terrible things and cover it up. And those things do challenge me still about my church. I've got to make sure that can never be repeated, and that such cultural changes is necessary to ensure that's never repeated, and that every young person, every vulnerable person are in the safest possible place when they're in a church place. That has really challenged me, but I think just like your experience, to find a survivor of such evil who still wants a relationship with God and perhaps the church, it is shocking and it is hugely confirming. And I've experienced that. Now I've also experienced some people very angry at the church, understandably, absolutely. In fact, in some ways I find that easier to make human sense of than the one that still wants to be connected with us. But both challenge my faith and in some ways confirm it, mysteriously, but in some ways confirm it. Both for the very damaged person, the need for some healing, which a lot of ordinary human activities, try as we may, don't seem to bring, and for the one that still wants to hang on, that their faith's been tested in fire, and still they love God, or they want more, and that's a wonderful thing.
The persistence of faith is in some ways the shocking thing in our secular world, in individual cases, but also as a society perhaps. I mean, as recently as 2014, there were more people in church on a Sunday than in all of South Australia. And there's a verse in the New Testament, in the letter to the Hebrews, that describes faith as the firm conviction of things hoped for, the certainty of things unseen, the sight metaphor again. What place can that kind of faith, that kind of conviction have in Australia today? And I ask this in light of actually one of the first questions coming through on the Q&A, in light of the current debates around religious freedom. What kind of faith, what kind of place does faith of that conviction have in a pluralistic, multi-faith community?
Well, the freedoms which we have enjoyed and the freedoms which are perhaps up for grabs with the politicians and the lobby groups on all sides of politicians, it's a recognition that faith is not only personal, it's actually part of your identity. It's deeply rooted, because as a Christian, I know I'm made in the image of God. That's why I enjoy my relationship with God, because I've been made for him. And I believe every human being is made in the image of God. Therefore, that would bring the greatest joy to them and to God, for them to also enjoy that relationship. So to take away the freedom of faith, that one could not express what you believe, and it's like a person who's engaged. They're engaged because they keep if the lady shows you the ring 100 times, they tell you what's happening, they go through all the wedding plans, you don't even need to know about it, but the excitement and the joy of engagement is just wonderful. And that's the joy of being, as it were, engaged to God, wedded to God, and with a future. And that's part of my identity. Just like you move from engagement, from single to be engaged to being married, your identity has changed at that level. And as a whole new, fresh outlook. Now that's the freedom which we ought not to take away. And that ought to be free for Muslims and Hindus and Sikhs, as well as for Christians and Jews. And I think, and that's what we need to protect in our society, is I like to think of ourselves as being one culture of Australians with multi-ethnic aspects, multi-faith, but I want to see one culture, that we love Australia and we can get on with one another, even when we might have differences between each other on matters as deeply sensitive as faith.
I think there are aspects of our culture that vaccinate people to faith, that by accident or by someone's design are there to make it hard to believe or hard to practice. There are people at the moment that would say, for instance, we should ban nativity scenes from shopping malls at Christmas time. The most simple little reminders of a Christian civilization, of Christian faith, you've got to get rid of them all, because you've got to have nothing that encourages that terrible superstition that is faith. There is this kind of radical, absolutist secularism in some quarters that will brook no space for faith and the faithful. But we know that most people say they have some faith, that many people, whether or not they have faith, honour the things that faith communities do. They like their schools or their hospitals or their aged care facilities or their social services, St Vincent de Paul, the Smith family and the others feeding people on the streets. In so many different ways, they're doing things that contribute to the richness of our community. And I think Australians historically have been a very good model to the world of a live and let live, that my neighbour could be this religion or that religion and I can still get to know her, get to know him and treasure and love their little world that they come from. Not go to war with each other. We don't have civil wars over religion in this country or riots and attacks on each other because of our faith, or happily it's only happened very rarely indeed. We've been mostly a live and let live people, and that's something very precious we need to hold on to.
Sure.
And those pressures at the moment to stop being live and let live people when it comes to faith, I think that's why there's the debates about religious freedom. In a sense, we didn't need those debates 20 years ago or 30 years ago because we took for granted that if my neighbour's an Anglican or my neighbour is a Muslim, that's fine. I'll get to know him, I'll get to love him, my children will end up playing with him. We'll find that we've got a lot more in common than we have differences. We're going to find all sorts of ways of being good neighbours to each other. But now there are some that are hostile to that very pluralism, that want everyone to be a kind of practical agnostic or a public agnostic.
Just before we continue, if you have a paper question, a question on paper, now is the time to just hold that up so an usher can collect it, because the questions are already coming through here from your smartphones. Don't forget to write your question down with using slido.com. The question of a healthy secularity is a key one for our times. You used the example of marriage. It's a very auspicious example, given that these debates about religious freedom are occurring in the context of recent changes to the Marriage Act. There are segments of the Australian community who wouldn't describe their experience as one of having been live and let live, who felt marginalised, discounted, discriminated against. That's also part of the conversation that we're having as a community. So what resources does Christian theology have to offer a contemporary society that doesn't share the presuppositions of Christianity, that doesn't even necessarily universally accept that the churches are seeking the good of the wider community? How can Christian theology contribute then to a confident, robust pluralism?
Could I say, I think we've sometimes let people down. Christians have sometimes been very intolerant people, and they've hurt people, and we've just got to own up to that and learn from that and not do that again. But at the moment, I sense it's a bit like the playground, the kid that's been bullied in the playground and then becomes the bully in due course, that there are some people that have a grievance against Christians or our civilization, our traditions, whatever, because they feel they were bullied and now they've become the bullies and they're determined to get their own back, even though it's on a different group of people, perhaps a different generation. There's something of, I think, that the bullied becoming the bully going on at the moment. And I think both in being open to confessing where we've failed, which is something hugely important a whole community needs to be able to do, and do often when it fails, to also offer people then the sense that we can have a civil conversation about these things. We can respect each other even in our different opinions on some of these things. We can, as I said, live and let live. We can do that in not just I'll kind of close my eyes to your existence and just get on with mine, but actually find ways of seeing richness in this and ways of collaborating even amongst our differences. Christians, I think, can offer models of that because we're doing it together. The kind of ecumenism that tonight represents symbolically and that we've been doing now for 100 years in this country, that offers, I think, some models for civil conversation with not just between Christians, but between people of faith and people of no faith, or people of diverse lifestyles and perhaps ideologies, that we can find common ground, that we can find ways of respecting and loving each other and being good neighbours to each other.
Archbishop Davies, what do you think?
Yes, I think that we share a common anthropology, which, as I said before, being made in the image of God. Therefore, what Christians need to do is model that to non-Christians and in our society. And I think that we need to, one of the things that, which will come in the third lecture, is where love needs to characterise God's people. They'll know you're my disciples by the way you love one another. And it's not just loving other Christians, it's doing good to all people, especially the household of faith. So that sense in which we show a genuine love to the people with whom we disagree. Now, we need to model that as Christians. We need to be on the front foot, and I think, as Anthony said, we've not always done that well. We've been judgmental, we've been superior, we've demeaned people by a self-righteousness which does not characterise, should not characterise the people of God. So we don't always get things right. Not only do we need humility with regard to how much we know, we need a humility about how well we follow Jesus, and we need to have lives which continually seek God's forgiveness and often the forgiveness of others too. And surprisingly, that's why that's in the Lord's Prayer, which is Christians regularly pray.
We've been talking about some of the challenges and some of the changes in recent decades that might make someone pessimistic about the future of faith. Do you see any global or even more local cultural trends that could potentially be positive for the expression of faith, hope and love?
Well, I'm very confident about the global trends with faith. I mean, there's no doubt the proportion of people in the world who believe is growing all the time. The notion of the kind of secular inevitability thesis that as civilizations progress, they abandon religion and adopt some other way of finding meaning in life. In fact, you look at the progress of the world as a whole, and the faiths, and certainly Christian faith, is growing all the time. There are pockets of the world, like our own backyard, which we can, I think, mistakenly think, well, it must be like this everywhere or in a very large part of the world, where faith is increasingly on the back foot. But certainly when I look at our planet, at the global situation for faith, it's very promising.
Apart from demographics, are there cultural elements to this though, or is there something beyond the number crunching that gives you cause for optimism?
Yes, because I think many of the best ideas being globalised, like the human rights idea, is essentially a Christian inheritance and underpinned by Christian views of the human person and the human community, what it is to flourish, what it is to be responsible alongside others and for others. And that idea is, as I say, being globalised. So not only is faith growing, but many of the inheritances that civilizations have received from the Christian faith and Jewish and other faiths too, are in fact, they also are spreading through the world and an enormous benefit to the world. Now that we find many things now internationally as unthinkable, which were in fact very commonplace, and they were terrible degradations and violence towards the human person, but which now there's a kind of universal consensus amongst the nations of the world: you can't do this, these rights are to be respected. And that's one of the great things that Judeo-Christianity has given humanity, and not just the Christian parts of humanity, because it's spread beyond.
I think Western civilization, as it's often described, has deep Christian roots, but of late, around the Western, if I said the Western civilized world, that's been overturned. And you can see that in North America and in Great Britain. But if you go to Africa and South Korea and South America, you see a great resurgence of people of faith. So they're across different cultures. I mean, I think there are more missionaries from South Korea than any other country around the world. That's an extraordinary thing to say. There are more Anglicans in Nigeria and Uganda than in Australia, New Zealand, North America and England combined. So it just shows you that we think we're in a microcosm of the world here. We are not. We are an aberration to what's happening around the rest of the world. And that's what, although I love Australia, Australia does not reflect the dimensions of faith which are springing up around the world.
There's a question here about the place of doubt in the life of faith. Are there times when that's been significant for you, when you've doubted elements of your faith, and how did you move through that?
I had a number of doubts, particularly in my late teens, early 20s. I remember pacing up and down the top of Fisher Library, it's University of Sydney, trying to work out...
Great name.
You know, I'd never thought of that. I doubt if I will again. So that sense, you know, I just remember as a university undergraduate trying to work things out, and that was a great time. And I came to the realisation this really was true. And for me personally, I've never doubted my faith in God since that sort of critical time. Now, I might have had doubts about all kinds of different things in life, but not a doubt that God loved me and he saved me by his Son. And for me personally, now that's not been a doubt that I've actually entertained now since those days.
Is doubt a fleeting memory for you, Archbishop Fisher, or a more constant companion?
Look, I think my faith is challenged all the time. It's challenged by things going on around me in the world. It's challenged by things going on in my own heart, my life. And I talked tonight about the time when I was very sick. And anyone in that situation, I could have died, I was very close to death, I was in terrible pain. Anyone in that sort of situation is going to be asking, is there really a God? Does he really love me? Why does he let this happen to me? And others were asking me that, certainly. My mum kept asking, you know, I think she thought archbishops should somehow be quarantined from such things. God should just look after archbishops, and certainly should look after her son. And so I think my faith was challenged in that experience. I think probably come out of that tunnel the stronger for it, certainly different in some ways.
Why stronger? What was it that made it stronger?
Well, I think at the end of it, I had a stronger than ever sense that I was held by a loving God, that I was sustained, that I would get through this, that there was reason for hope. And now I could well understand someone in the next bed with a similar background and similar experience, that could be the rocks on which their faith is shipwrecked. And no, it's not because they're ill-willed or unreasonable or something. It just has gone differently in our lives. But in my own, I came out surer than ever about that I was held in being and sustained every moment of my life by a loving God. And by a loving Christian community. The endless prayers that were being offered for me, might I say, including by my Anglican friends, not just by Catholics, that were being offered for me through that time, that was hugely sustaining, emotionally, humanly, and I believe it was collaborating with God in one of our great Christian works, which is intercession for each other.
Mm.
But having faith doesn't mean there's no challenges, there's no hard bits. There are hard bits, and there are times when there are big questions that you're puzzling, perhaps for years and years, and times when your faith matures or changes, the ways that you think back and think, oh, that seemed so simple back then, but now I see some other aspects, or I've deepened in my relationship. It was very childish in some ways before. Faith changes.
Faith can be weak or strong, and I think I'd use weak or strong rather than doubts for me. But Jesus talked about the faith the size of a mustard seed is sufficient. So you can be strengthened your faith, and your faith can be strengthened. For me, when I travel to different parts of the world and meet Christians for the first time and realise I have a link and a bond with them, which is just automatically and immediate, because we both know God and the Saviour, and that strengthens my faith enormously, as it does the prayers of God's people, as Anthony said too.
What about the experience of disagreement then? We are all so aware of the diversity of Christian organisations and expressions in the world. There's a question here about if there's one Bible, one God, one gospel, what are we to do with profound disunity and sometimes very hurtful disagreement between people within the household of faith? And we saw this, to pick up one of the other questions there, during the postal survey on the marriage law, where people of faith held very different views, voted very differently on that point. What do we do with disagreements like that, and what does that say about faith today?
We certainly don't have a track record of good disagreements in the past. We've mentioned the Reformation.
I don't know what the body count was, but...
I just thought I'd mention it again, just in case you'd forgotten it. And the sectarianism we had in Australia, of course, too. The reality is we don't know everything, and we can get things wrong. The basics, I talked about that we both believe the Creed, we both believe the Bible, and there are certain things where we might, there are additional things, in church history, and I can think of examples where the two of us might differ. It's not actually biblical, but extra biblical, where differences might be, and where tradition might take hold a greater sense of authority than it would for me in the Anglican Church. But having said that, I'm a frail human being, and I can get things wrong, and therefore, and even though I believe, I imagine I'm going to find all kinds of things, hopefully little things rather than big things, but when I get to heaven. But when I get to heaven, I won't remember all the things I got wrong, fortunately. That'll be part of the perfection. And all the questions I have now about what does that verse mean, what does that verse mean, I'm sure they'll all disappear. When Paul writes the Philippians, he mentions two women by name, Euodia and Syntyche, probably why no one takes those names today. And he talks about these two women disagreeing in the congregation. Now, how would you like to have your name read out in a public letter from the apostle and find that, the pastor says to you, oh, by the way, he mentions you this morning. Well, you'll be interested in this part of the letter.
That's why the Corinthians lost a few, I reckon.
And he encourages someone to help them agree together in the Lord. That ought to be our aim across denominations. I think it's a terrible thing that we have different denominations. We ought to be one. That would be good. But human frailty gets in the way. Human frailty gets in the way, and human sin, and pride, a whole range of things. But on the other hand, we still can rejoice and celebrate the things we share and know we believe 100% together.
Some disagreement's healthy. Now, I think within my church, there's a very broad range of views on a lot of things. We still hold together as one. I often find I'm in more agreement with some of my friends in some of the other churches on many things than some of my co-religionists in the Catholic Church. And I think we've probably all experienced that at different times. But our churches do make space for quite a lot of disagreement, some of which is quite healthy.
And we can change our minds too, because someone might be able to persuade
We
us.
learn
of a
from each other.
Exactly.
And by having the debates, we make some progress. You know, you think of the great councils of the church by which we settled our creeds. They were rigorous debates, often even violent debates. But the arguments actually help to sharpen our understanding of the faith that we'd received. And so I think some disagreement amongst Christians is actually healthy. It's because we're human beings with an intellect and a heart, and so we're going to come to differences of opinion on all sorts of things like we do as citizens. It's not unhealthy that in Australia we have more than one political party. In fact, the countries that only have one are not so admirable. And so I'm happy that there is space for debate and for sharpening our ideas and learning from each other. And so, but I also recognise that some of this is human limitation and sin. We can be very prejudiced and angry and determined to get our own way, and that can happen with institutions as well as individuals. And so my daily prayer with Christ is that they may be one as you and I are one, my Father. That's Christ's prayer on his last night before his crucifixion, was for Christian unity, and I keep praying for that and working in every way I can. And so while I recognise some disagreements are very healthy and even beautiful, I also recognise that some of this is not the Lord's will for us, and it's a scandal to the world. It turns people off the gospel when they see Christians fighting.
I'm not sure if you're promising to bring more disagreement to us over the coming nights. But
we haven't agreed about that yet, actually. So,
I'm not sure I even agree with you.
We will be back again tomorrow to speak about hope, perhaps even about heaven, and the night after to speak more about love. So would you please join me in thanking Archbishop Davies and Archbishop Fisher.
Thank you.